floor today to discuss the gravity of the current situation with regard to the administration's negotiations with Iran for a nuclear agreement. And it is, I think, important to note that we received some important information today in the Senate Armed Services Committee that is helpful to us in this regard. This morning, the Armed Services Committee heard from Admiral Bill Gortney. He gave us his assessment of Iran's capabilities and ongoing efforts to thwart international agencies. Admiral Gortney is the commander of the U.S. Northern Command. He's personally responsible for defending Americans in the United States mainland. This is an appointee of President Obama, and here are the words given to us today by Admiral Gortney, and I quote, "Iran has committed considerable resources to enhancing its ballistic missile capabilities and has already placed another satellite into orbit this year using a new booster that could serve as a demonstrator for intercontinental ballistic missile technologies. Despite international condemnation and sanctions, Iran has failed to cooperate fully with the International Atomic Energy Agency to resolve all outstanding concerns regarding its nuclear program, particularly those concerning its possible military dimensions," unquote. Mr. President, these are the words from the head of the Northern Command in this administration. And this regime, which Admiral Gortney described, is the very regime our President and Secretary of State have confidence will live up to any nuclear agreement. As the Admiral went on to say, the hope for a diplomatic solution should not come without vigilance. And that's what members on this side of the aisle are trying to insist upon. We cannot ignore these warning signs of miscompliance and uncooperative behavior while expecting Iran to make good on its promises. A few days ago, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stressed Iran's record of misconduct and sinister objectives in his powerful address to Congress. He emphasized that a nuclear Iran would have serious implications for the world, for the region, and of course for Israel, one of our most steadfast allies. These concerns are important for lawmakers, and I'm glad we had a chance to hear them in person. With a record of foreign policy failures, I regret to say that President Obama is under intense scrutiny to hold Iran accountable at this critical moment. He is under intense scrutiny because of these foreign policy failures. Like many of my colleagues, I'm concerned, and I think Americans are concerned, that the administration might be too generous with concessions to Iran, as it has been with deals in the past. Time is running out for the President to establish his legacy, a dangerous motivation for negotiations with the unreliable and volatile nation Admiral Gortney described today. At the very least, the Senate should insist on the passage of a bipartisan bill to ensure American people have a say in any agreement between the White House and Iran. Congressional approval would add legitimacy to any agreement, and I think that is important. Any foreign nation negotiating with the United States should be mindful of our constitutional system of checks and balances. Congress should also be discussing the appropriate steps to take if an agreement is not reached by the deadline this month. The President is now threatening to veto legislation that puts tougher sanctions on Iran. But shouldn't there be consequences for Iran if they refuse to cooperate with international investigators? The stakes are too high to make excuses for stalled negotiations or to allow wishful thinking about Iran's intentions. As Mr. Netanyahu said in his speech, quote, "If Iran wants to be treated like a normal country, let them act like a normal country." Instead, Iran continues to support terrorist groups and oppressive authoritarian regimes. We can't afford to ignore its influence in unstable areas and how this influence could dramatically change should they be allowed to develop a nuclear weapon. Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech is a reminder that Iran has made no excuses for its belligerent aims and ties to terrorist groups. A bad deal would spell disaster for Israel, whose very existence has been threatened by Iranian leaders. Israel and the United States share an unwavering commitment to keeping Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. It is unfortunate that criticism from the Obama administration surrounded the Prime Minister's earlier visit. Meanwhile, the world is not safer. Global threats continue to multiply, posing complex challenges to America's national security issues. One looks at the unrest around the world, and it is easy to see how America is failing to lead. Another member of this administration, Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, underscored the widespread instability when he testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee last month. It's important to compare Director Clapper's testimony with that of the Secretary of State earlier. Director Clapper, our Director of National Intelligence, said there are more deaths from state-sponsored mass killings, more people displaced from their homes, and a higher rate of political instability last year than we've seen in decades. In fact, 2014 was the most lethal year on record for terrorism. We are now facing unpredictable instability as the new normal, according to this administration's Director of National Intelligence. The White House Foreign Policy team, however, seems unwilling to accept these harsh truths. Listen to the words of Secretary of State John Kerry, our chief negotiator with Iran. He said, in contrast to the words of our Director of National Intelligence, Secretary Kerry said, we are actually living in a period of less daily threat to Americans and to people in the world than normally. Less deaths, less violent deaths today than throughout the last century. It's hard to square the testimony of our chief negotiator with Iran with the words of our Director of National Intelligence. Particularly troubling is the administration's past reliance on empty promises from adversaries. Under President Obama's watch, Vladimir Putin has invaded and annexed part of Ukraine, continued to support the brutal regime of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, and violated the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. On February 27th, we saw yet another troubling development in Moscow. Opposition leader Boris Nemtsov was gunned down in cold blood on the street after dinner in a secure, well-protected part of Moscow, just steps away from the Kremlin. The Russian government has denounced Mr. Nemtsov's assassination, but this is not the first time that one of President Putin's opponents or critics has been murdered. I will only note that Mr. Nemtsov is only the latest in a line of Putin critics who have mysteriously met their demise over time. And Russia's record of corruption and shameful disregard for human rights continues. In conclusion, Mr. President, United States leadership is of the utmost importance to global security and stability at this pivotal time. Director Clapper was frank in his testimony that, and I quote, pervasive uncertainty makes it all the harder to predict the future, unquote, which is why we must remain vigilant. America can succeed if we demonstrate the fortitude and resolve necessary to defend freedom and stop those who threaten it. This includes taking an honest look at Iran's past and present behavior before we cut a deal that we will later regret.